I'm delighted to welcome Sjeng Scheijen. Sjeng is an author, internationally acclaimed expert on Russian art. He has curated several important exhibitions in London, Groningen and elsewhere, and is the former cultural attaché to the Royal Netherlands Embassy in Moscow. His previous book, Diaghilev, A Life, received much critical acclaim, being described as masterful by The Guardian and magnificent by the Daily Mail. But today he's here to talk about his latest book, which is a fascinating study called The Avant-Gardists. Subtitle is Artists in Revolt in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, 1917 to 1935. And just to set the scene, it's October 1917. The Russian Revolution has wiped the old tsarist empire off the map, and artists like Marc Chagall, Wassily Kandinsky, Alexander Rodchenko, Olga Rozanova, Vladimir Tatlin, and other avant-garde artists have participated in the revolutionary struggle, transforming inner cities with their progressive murals, posters, installations, and performances. But the new political leaders soon want nothing to do with these radical artists. So while their reputation is growing in Europe, they experience increasing pressure in the Soviet Union. Here to tell us all about it is Sjeng Scheijen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cormac, for this introduction. It's a great delight and honor to be here in Dublin today to talk to you about my book. Well, let's start immediately with this first slide. You see one of the most pivotal, most symbolic, I think, artworks of that era, revolutionary art by Vladimir Tatlin. You maybe have seen this image before, although the artist itself is not so well known. This was an enormous project, a model actually for a much larger building that was supposed to be higher even than the Eiffel Tower, because it was a monument to the Third International and therefore to the Communist Revolution. So it should be the highest building in the world, and it had all kinds of turning volumes in it. You can see them. It's a cylinder, a half bowl, and others, and a pyramid. And those were turning around, and there were ministries there, and the Ministry for Propaganda. Radio waves were sending out all over the world. This was all the idea. So it was a revolutionary monument by one of the most revolutionary artists of the time, and it gives you an idea of the scope and the ambition that these artists had, not only to make art revolutionary in a formal sense, but to be a living part of the revolutionary movement itself. We will come back to Tatlin later. And here we see Tatlin working on the model with some of his assistants, and you can have another look at it and about these volumes that were made of glass. And of course, all kinds of ideas about the avant-garde and about modernist art movements in itself have gone round. And one of the things that I try to do is at least demythologize a lot of these assumptions about what the avant-garde is. It's, I think, not radical rationalism, it's not machine art. Constructivism is a very broad term that often is used, but also that doesn't cover it completely. What it does, I'll try to answer in the next 45 minutes. Another very current assumption about the Russian avant-garde, and maybe avant-garde art in particular, is that it's the birthplace of an abstract aesthetic. And of course it is. Abstract art is one of the great innovations of this era, and it had an enormous impact on the art world. But when we see these artworks, like Malevich's work on the right, in a current museum, in a gallery, in a wide space, we see in a way only half of it. Because these works of art were not particularly meant for these cerebral places, for these places of worship in a way of art. These artists thought of themselves as artists who were working on the street, whose work would have an immediate impact, not so much on the factualities of the revolution, but about the spiritual ideas behind it. So they saw themselves as a kind of spiritual engineers, engineers of the soul, engineers of mentalities, and for that reason, if we only look at those works as a kind of cerebral things in a secluded space, we imagine them in a space which is only meant for art, we do not fully comprehend what they were meant to be. These artists certainly did not saw themselves as people who were working for a secluded art space. For them, art and life should be one. And this was one of the, I think, founding ideas, the most principal ideas of this particular art movement, that art and life were the same. That if this revolution of the soul, because for them it's, the political revolution was just a side effect of something much bigger, of a revolution of the soul, then all human beings would become artists. And their art was to be a kind of forebearer, a kind of a prophecy of a fully artistic life for every man on earth. It was a big ambition, obviously, and maybe with hindsight, a bit funny even, or exaggerated. But it was firmly what they believed, and I think that the revolutionary impact they had all over the world, but because they had, is really coming from this enormous ambition. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to accomplish what they in the end did. But when the revolution happened, they saw that obviously as a kind of possibility for them. They were artists that were formerly more or less repressed or not taken were not valued as they saw it by the former establishment. So they saw this political revolution obviously as a pivotal moment to come out and to play the historical role that they had thought for themselves. And they were given this possibility by this man, Anatoly Lunacharsky, who was the new Commissar of Enlightenment, the kind of Minister of Culture in the new Bolshevik government. And this happened quite early, in early months of 1980, so 4 or 5 months after the revolution. And many historians thought this was logically an immediate outcome of Bolshevik policies, right? So they are a revolutionary party, they lead a revolutionary movement, so they need revolutionary art. It seems logical, but it wasn't. In a way, Lunacharsky did not really value this artist. He thought Kandinsky was a kind of bestial figure, Chagall was an idiot, Malevich was somebody who he wouldn't give any attention at all to. But he needed people to govern his new Ministry of Enlightenment. He needed artists who were willing to cooperate with the revolution. And in these early stages of the revolution, the Bolsheviks had an enormous problem in general, not only in the art world, but in general, to get support from the establishment. They needed to rule, obviously, and to rule they needed support from civil servants, from the ministries, from the whole bureaucracy of the Russian Empire, the former Tsarist Empire. And they were confronted with an enormous amount of protest from these circles. So everywhere they were looking for people who were willing to support them, even if they weren't Bolsheviks. These artists certainly weren't Bolsheviks. They were very apolitical in a way, very naively political, I would say. But at least they were willing to do that. They were willing to take up these particular positions. And then something really extraordinary happened, an extraordinary event in, I think, European history, that some of the greatest artists living were given very powerful, high positions in the new government. And they became powerful civil servants. So Malevich, he became chairman of the museum board, and in a way he ruled over all the museums in the former Tsarist empire. Marc Chagall, not always connected, I think, historically with the revolution, because he was already for many years active in France before the revolution. But he came back in February 1917, specifically because he wanted to be part of this new movement, and became, in the early months of 1918, this Commissar of Art and Culture in Vitebsk, and therefore he was the ruling person in the art worlds in what is now more or less Belarus. Kandinsky, who was the only one of these people who had some kind of formal education. He was had a judicial background as a jurist. He got various positions in all kinds of institutes, mostly because he was the only one who could really write down policy papers. So this was, he was therefore extremely valuable to them. And last, Vladimir Tatlin, the man who later, 2 years later, built this enormous monument to the Third International. He became the art boss of Moscow, in a way could, well, give all the commissions and hand out all the money to artists. So this was an enormous event. All these artists who were coming from the margins of society, who were mostly very poor. Malevich had only had some education until he was 11. He got his first pair of shoes when he was 10. He was from a really very poor background. Marc Chagall, who was from a Jewish minority, and as you know, the Jews were enormously discriminated against under the Tsars. He became this powerful figure. Tatlin, who was who had worked as a sailor, and who ran away from home because he was from a very difficult social background as well, and had no formal education also. They had some education in art schools, but certainly not in the big ones in the capitals, Moscow and St. Petersburg, then Petrograd named. So these marginal figures who were poor and not recognized by the Tsarist establishment suddenly became the most powerful figures in the Russian art world. And this certainly is a utopian moment, because as you maybe know, the first socialist utopian thinkers like Fourier or Saint-Simon thought of a government by philosophers, poets and artists to govern a new world after a socialist revolution. So in a way, this was a prophecy come true. There is another aspect to these artists. I said they were socially marginalized before the revolution, but most of them also were ethnically from a variety of groups. And it's important to understand that Tsarist society was a very multicultural society. So just before the revolution, less than 50% of the whole population of the Russian Empire had Russian as their mother tongue. So more than 50% had all these other languages, and there were almost 170 languages counted nowadays, and that's even a very arbitral number. You could argue easily that there would be 300 or 350 languages. Not to speak about ethnicities, what is a more difficult interpretation. But at least Malevich, who was Polish and therefore Catholic, was certainly a part of a discriminated against minority. Chagall I mentioned as a Jew, of course. Tatlin was partly Ukrainian, and this is only part of the, let's say, background of these figures, and most of these avant-garde artists had one or another particular background that would make them discriminated against in the Tsarist establishment. Also typical, I think, for that period is that almost half of all the artists were women. So in a world and European perspective, this was a unique event. There was a new wave of artists, and half of them were women. And they were playing the same revolutionary roles. They were making abstract art. They were bringing these new art concepts into design and fashion and building and architecture. So a few of them are mentioned here. Natalia Goncharova is maybe the most well-known, and she was the one who already traveled to Europe long before the revolution and stayed there and worked, for example, for Diaghilev's enterprises. So that's why she is one of the most well-known. And some of the others, especially Rozanova and Popova, who were incredible artists both, they died very young in the early years after the revolution because of the shortages and the enormous social and economic problems that immediately came after the revolution. Alexander Ekster is one of the Ukrainian artists who were part of this movement, and she later on also went to Paris. Then, of course, as I said, these artists got the possibility to govern the art world, and they took that on themselves with the typical kind of vigor and energy that was so typical of everything they did. And they got the opportunity to re-establish and redesign public space in Moscow, Petrograd, and some of the other provincial towns. And Lenin had proposed the idea, which is called Lenin's Plan for Monumental Propaganda, to redesign public space in order to make propaganda for this new revolutionary and communist world. So the old statues of tsars and generals were taken down, very often with the help of these artists, and new monuments had to be erected in order to make known to the public the great heroes of the socialist movement, also historically. So this started with Spartacus as the kind of first socialist leader, and all kinds of famous figures from the Marxist history, like Marx himself, of course, and Bakunin, were chosen to have new statues. And one of the first ones that was erected by the Avant-Gardists was this monument to Bakunin. It's a futurist statue made out of concrete, this new revolutionary material. Artists were not longer working with marble or with bronze or whatever, but with this democratic material, concrete. And this is what came out of it, an enormous statue, like an Italian futurist, moving and bulky Bakunin. And this was obviously not really what the Bolsheviks intended. They, in a way, had quite conservative tastes and liked that art should be easy to understand so that it could be used for propaganda purposes. So there was an immediate problem here with the artistic ideas of these artists and the Bolshevik leaders. So this particular monument, it was erected. Then the Bolsheviks, should have opened it, but they never did because they were they didn't like it. And then it was taken down after 4 or 5 months. As a typical example, and in a way, it was the only real monument that these artists erected. But they got a second chance, because in November 1918, the 1-year anniversary of the revolution was celebrated during in revolutionary Russia. But the Bolshevik leaders at the time were still enormously busy with the civil war. And they were still fighting white generals in Ukraine and in Crimea and in Siberia. they had something else to do than, you know, watch over what the artists were doing in order to make this celebration. And they got the possibility to completely redesign the most important public spaces in the capitals. And this is one of the projects that they started upon. It's the square before the Hermitage, of what is now the Hermitage. If you've ever been to St. Petersburg, then you know what enormous size it is. It has this very giant monument in the middle, and they completely redesigned it with abstract works above the entrances of the streets, and they made a completely new installation around the central monument. So this is design, and it was eventually also really erected, and you can have an idea about the size of this. So these are human beings. You see here the abstract installation, kind of wooden panels. This is the monument itself, or what is left of it. And here as well, if you see, so this is a human being, and there another one. So you can have an idea of the size of this thing. And as it was at least intended, that this, this monument looked like a rocket to be sent into space as a farewell to the old order. Also interesting are the black squares that were erected here, because the black square, originally for the first time made by Malevich, was also seen as a typical revolutionary symbol, as a kind of an end stop, a point to the old regime. So the avant-gardists for some time tried to make the black square into the symbol of the revolution before the now well-known red flag with the hammer and sickle was established as the official form for the revolutionary state. This went also in some of the provincial towns. So this was Vitebsk in 1990, 1 year later, with great decorations made by L. Lisitsky, who was more or less Malevich's first and most important student. And we see here decorations in Petrograd on Nevsky Prospect, the most beautiful and greatest thoroughfare in the city. So not everything was completely abstract. There were some futurist or cubist artists working there as well. And you see here also other panels on, this is also Nevsky. And this is part in Moscow with also futurist decorations here and enormous panels over there. It's good to understand that these really revolutionary, innovative artists who were making abstract art were a very small group relatively. So for these revolutionary decorations, they needed the support also of more modernist or less radical artists as well. Still, all of these artists were very young, and they were in a way taking over the old artistic establishment as it existed before. And it was a giant endeavor of these artists. In a way, we are known to Christo's enormous installations in the public sphere, but these were much bigger. And so the complete redesign of Palace Square that I just mentioned was enormously bigger than anything that Christo ever did. And when you look at the whole city, they also packed in some of the trees with purple gaze, and they were painting streets, painting buildings. It was really an enormous almost complete redesign of the whole public sphere. This continued later on, but the most immediate effect of what they did in 1918 was an enormous protest from, let's say, middle management circles and from the Bolshevik leadership. Because, as you can imagine, this would have been revolutionary and unheard of in every European town. Nobody was accustomed to this particular kind of artistic language. And although Russia was at the forefront of all these movements, for the general audience, for the middle management of the Bolshevik Party and especially of the leadership, this was far, far, far too much, and it went far too far for them. They thought of it as elitist, incomprehensible, crazy, all kinds of unworthy notions were given to it. So, in a way, this event in November 1918 led to more or less the start of the demise of the avant-garde. Gradually, they were taken off their positions. They were again slowly but securely marginalized and brought back into the art sphere at first, and later on even they were completely marginalized at such a scale that they could not work as artists anymore, but that was later. Although here and there, these artists could still do some work in the public sphere, which, as I told before, was their main ambition. So we see here a so-called agitation train by Wassily Yermilov, who was a Ukrainian artist working in Kharkiv. And so mainly in the provinces, and later on this movement went through a bit still, but mostly beginning in the capitals, the avant-gardists were thrown out of the government. And this is one of the last things I think that the avant-gardists could erect in 1927. Yermilov, and this was a giant installation in Kharkiv. And it's a wonderful thing made out of wood that would celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the revolution. So it's in Ukrainian, 10 roки жовтня. But still, if we look at all this, we see political artists at work. But that is only half, and maybe not even the most important half of what they were. And if we should focus only on that, then it also not becomes clear why they were taken out of the powerhouse so early. Because if we really look into what they want to develop and what their ideas were, then we see something completely different. As I said before, it was far more a spiritual movement than a political movement. And this spirituality was not something holy, not something divine. It was carnivalesque. It was a kind of spirituality which was very much located in the body. And we see that when we go a few years back, before the revolution, in many of their artworks, and the things that they did in public space. So here we see Malevich on the right, Matushin, who was a theorist, and the poet Khrushchev in one of the photos that they made for their upcoming exhibition, which was in 1915, where the black square of Malevich was for the first time showed. And beside that, they were having a lot of fun. You see also that the picture behind them is standing on top. So the piano, you see, is hanging from the ceiling. And they made a whole lot of like these funny pictures in order to promote this exhibition. And obviously, this was something unheard of, and this was even for Dada. But it has, of course, this typical Dada kind of feel. Tatlin, for example, who looked at this very serious art constructor, and he promoted himself as such. But he also was a Carnivalesque figure who liked to dress up and take all kinds of different roles. So also just before the First World War, he dressed up as a blind Ukrainian bandura player and promoted himself as a living exhibition piece in traveling exhibitions. And this was the way how he could travel, and he ended up in Berlin in 1913, and from there he traveled to Paris for the first and only time in his life in order to meet Picasso. And there was a later on famous and also a bit mythologized meeting between these two figures. But this particular thing of dressing up, taking on a different role, was very typical for these people. And also it gives an idea of their battle against seriousness, I would say. And if you look at that particular part of their artistic output, then it becomes more clear why they could not adapt to this new world of political harshness and new political reality. Here we see also just before the revolution how they painted their faces with futurist and abstract signs and walked over the street while reading poetry or just shouting in a way to arouse, you know, the anger of the bourgeois. And they were very, very good at that. So they announced their walks with their painted faces in the newspapers, so that a lot of crowd would gather, and they would make a scandal. So it was all part of this great scandalous nature of what they were doing, and this was a regular part of their artistic activities. Exhibitions, if they were made in a gallery, were almost always accompanied by performances, by trying to get the public attention through scandal and doing crazy things, walking in the nude, etc., etc. One of these typical figures, now mostly forgotten, but I always take him as a kind of example because he was typical for the bigger movement of the avant-garde was Vladimir Goldschmidt, who called himself a life futurist, who did yoga exercises on stage, who did jiu-jitsu performances on stage, who walked in the nude during winter, and of course, he more or less did everything to attract attention and to arouse the discontent of the bourgeoisie. They did so with a group of people, and one of them was Tatlin's later fiancé and his main co-worker at the famous monument to the Third Avant-Garde, to the Third International, and that was Sofia Dimshitz-Tolstaya, who was married to one of the Tolstoy writers, not Lev Tolstoy, but Alexei Tolstoy, but a very famous figure, the least, and very rich, of course. The Tolstoys were one of the main aristocratic families in the empire. But she was also Jewish, so he's one of these figures who went through everything, and later on, still, I think she remained her position as a not so powerful, but still as a civil servant in the middle management of the Ministry of Enlightenment. Another typical example is the Rodchenko family here on the right, who always dressed up and made performances. On the left is one of the great muses of the avant-garde, Mayakovsky's girlfriend. And you see what I would call an avant-garde lifestyle arise here, right? So for them, again, art should not be confined to the artist studio. It should not be confined to museums or galleries. It should be something that is lived continuously. And if you see all that, it becomes more understandable. That not only because of their formal language, but also because of their mentality, that they really could not be integrated in the new Bolshevik government. Well, here's some more pictures of the Rodchenko family. Stepanov and Rodchenko were a famous pair. Dressing up, dancing, crazy hairdos, etc., etc. We would call it a queer lifestyle, I think, today. Still, after they left these high positions in the government, they were given some other positions here and there, still also because the Bolsheviks were still lacking in personnel, were still lacking in people who at least wanted to work for the new revolutionary world. Most of the establishment figures, of course, they left for Europe, or they fled to the United States. So still on in the early 20s, they had some kind of possibilities. And one of the things they also did is what we would call the birth of the Modern Art Museum. They founded with almost no government support, to be sure, but still they got a space and a very small salary, what we now call the Museum of Painterly Culture, and in Leningrad, the Institute of Artistic Culture. And both of them have played a very great role because, for example, when Barr, the founder of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, who was in a way the model for almost all modern art museums existing today, he went to Moscow in the 20s, late 20s, and researched all these ideas behind this new institute and took them with him when he founded the Museum of Modern Art and its ideas of how to teach the public, how to present contemporary abstract and modern art in general. So a lot of these ideas, although the institutes themselves were very small in the revolutionary state in Russia, they had an enormous impact later on. This is the museum in Moscow, which was headed by Drevin, not so well-known Rodchenko, and for a short time also by Kandinsky, before Kandinsky left to, firstly to France in 1924, and in Leningrad by Malevich. And especially the Leningrad branch has grown into a kind of mythological institute, but it certainly was extremely important. The things they were doing are the kind of programs that you still see today in modern art museums or in contemporary art centers. So a mixture of not only art on the walls, but of installations, of performances, of lectures, of teachings, of the use of all kinds of other artistic disciplines like poetry and drama, together with the art. And all these things were experimented, established, and theorized upon in these years. One of the most intellectual endeavors was the Academy of Artistic Sciences, which was founded by Kandinsky, who was a real intellectual and before the revolution published serious theoretical books. About the spirituality of art is maybe the most well-known of Kandinsky's texts, but it was he wrote a bit much more, and the real width of his ideas are established in this Academy of Artistic Sciences. It was so not an art academy where you learned to make art. It was an academy where art was researched, but through a variety of means, so not by art historical means, by means of sociology, by means of the natural sciences, by biology even, by neurology. All kinds of new ideas were used in order to try to understand what art really was and how it functioned. But as I said before, all these wonderful ideas clashed with the, not only the political purposes, but also with the tastes of the Bolshevik leader. And just to give an example, immediately when Lenin came to power, he in a way gave the assignment to what he considered to be the greatest artist, living artist in Russia, who was Isaac Brodsky, to become his personal or court painter, one could say. So the painting here to the left was the first that Brodsky made of Lenin. And there is a famous and very often reproduced work here on the left, Lenin working in Smolny. And just after Lenin died, Brodsky made this gigantic painting of Lenin. And we see Brodsky here standing, just to give an idea of the size, which was in a way the beginning of a personality cult in Russia, which started, of course, with the cult of Lenin, and only later on, in the mid-30s, became also the cult of Stalin. But this cultivation of Lenin's personality in art started actually immediately after he died, and the enormous painting by Brodsky is a clear example. And you can imagine, if this Brodsky was a great artist. He was a wonderful realist, very technically well accomplished, but not the kind of arts like Kandinsky, Malevich, or Lissitzky. And you can imagine that if this was the taste and the idea of what good art was of the Bolsheviks, and this was also the kind of art that they wanted to use for propaganda purposes, then they needed to get rid of the avant-garde. And it was a typical feature of Bolshevik society that they could not allow for other ideas to come to the fore. Because if you really believe that the society that you are shaping is the one society that really should shape history, and the only one society that is that gives real power to all people and real justice, then obviously no other ideas can stand in between to that. And that also means no other aesthetic is possible. And while the power of the Bolsheviks grew, also the idea of pluralism in the arts grow well, smaller and smaller, and in a way necessarily only one aesthetic should survive. And it's important to understand that the Bolsheviks, and this is general not only in the art world, it was everywhere, in the 20s were still struggling to monopolize the whole world. So when they came to power, the Bolsheviks were a rather small party, of course. And there were many other revolutionary parties, and there were, of course, a lot of people who not supported revolution at all. So it took them a lot of time to really monopolize the whole world, also in, let's say, more ideological and aesthetics and governing. So that's one of the reasons why only in the 30s realism became the sole and only means of making art. This being said, that the repression of the avant-garde started already in 1919, so it became, during the 20s, more and more difficult for them to exhibit works, to take, to be part of big government-sponsored exhibitions. They only had their own very small spaces and small schools where they were teaching, or at these few museums where they could at least show some of their works. This in the 20s, in the 30s, even that all stopped. And some of these artists, they tried to adapt for psychological reasons, because they were so engaged with the revolution, that they just could not understand the idea that they were ostracized, so they adapted themselves. So we see Rodchenko, for example, here still in the 20s, in his revolutionary outfit that he himself designed, and some of his wonderful installations and the posters that they made with abstract art. And we see gradually evolve them into a style that is adapted for Stalinist propaganda. So they became mostly book designers, and as such played a role in Stalinist propaganda. We see, I must say, from an aesthetic point of view, wonderful combination of pictures you see here. It's a great work of art, but it is obviously Stalinist propaganda. Most difficult, I think, is Rodchenko's participation in the propaganda for the so-called Belomor Canal labor project, which was the first slave labor camp in the Soviet Union, and as such an example, or let's say a first try for what later would become the Gulag. And Rodchenko made a large reportage of that camp. And of course did not show the horrors that were already there. Many people died already then. 30,000 people in 1 year died during the making of the so-called Belomor Canal, which was the digging of a canal by political prisoners and ordinary prisoners alike. And if you look at Rodchenko's photographs, you see, you know, a happy bunch of well-fed prisoners who were re-educating themselves in order to support the new revolution, the new society. So there is this avant-garde paradox, obviously. And this is often underlined in many histories of the avant-garde, that the artists that remained in the Soviet Union, they more or less adapted or they just disappeared. Still, it is only a small part of their history. But even though they tried to adapt and they tried to still be a part of the revolutionary effort, they were also marginalized still. So if you look at Rodchenko's diaries in the 40s, it's a very sad acknowledgement of the fact that he is ostracized, that he doesn't play the role that he thinks as a great artist he should play, and that he doesn't want to be a part of this propaganda effort anymore, which in a way meant the end of his artistic career. So it was a very sad ending, even for those who tried to adapt. But for artists like Malevich and Tatlin, who did not or very partly adapt, it meant just that they could not work as artists anymore, or only in a very in a function like children's book illustrators, or as technicians in the theater, like Tatlin was, for example. So they were completely, and this was really my last slide, they disappeared from public life. The only thing that did not disappear, and this is a typical thing, I think, of Soviet society, because still something of the great intellectual atmosphere that was part of the Russian Empire still existed in the Soviet Union as well. It was obviously a society based on violence, but it was also a society based on a very difficult and intellectual philosophy, Marxism. And because of this strange paradox, intellectualism always played a very enormous part in Soviet society. And because there was this great intellectual substratum in society, a lot of their art, most of their art, has been saved by museum curators who took in the works, sometimes illegally, who tried to maintain these works of art by renaming them in the registrar of the museums, so that they could still be registered and be saved, or by putting them in extraordinary deposits, where they could later, in the 60s, can be freed from. Still, of course, in the 60s and 70s and even early 80s in the Soviet Union, they were not shown to public, but specialists and intellectuals and academics now and then could have access to these works in the depositories, and therefore could start the historization of this movement. And in a way, everything we know of most of them, with the exception maybe of Kandinsky, as I said, and Chagall, who went to Europe, is the effort of these intellectuals who saved these works of art and sometimes also smuggled them to the West. So what we have in European collections and in American collections is mostly art that was smuggled or taken by visitors to the Soviet Union who could then, bring it to the West. But mostly, as I said, by this substratum of intellectuals who saved this whole art movement from destruction and from marginalization in the Soviet Union. Thank you very much for your attention.